Welcome. Today we talk about a phenomenon that all public figures encounter. And not just that, but also anyone who finds themselves in the media spotlight hate and bullying. And what can we say about the leaders of entire countries? They face the most aggressive insults. But what's interesting is that bullying is not only carried out by ordinary people on the internet, but also by entire states. One of the most striking examples of state level bullying is North Korea. And today we'll talk about why the leadership of the DPRK uses the most sophisticated and vivid insults toward other countries and their leaders. Today, we will discuss the reasons behind such aggressive and elaborate diplomacy. Is this part of a psychological warfare? Or is it an attempt to prove their strength or independence? Or is it rhetoric aimed at a domestic audience? But before we move on to the discussion, I propose a little quiz. Who or which countries are these insults directed at? Let's start with the most obvious. Who is Duterte?
Well, it was Donald Trump. By the way, for many years, Americans, him, or those who managed his Twitter responded in a similar tough but rather restrained manner. It was also interesting when they threatened to break each other's noses. Yes, it happened.
Yes. So, who is typically being addressed? Behaves like a gangster.
Well, it's anyone and usually it's Americans, of course. Sometimes, but less often, there may be South Koreans.
Who is often an imperialist puppet?
Imperialist puppets, this is always 100% South Korea. Maybe sometimes about some other unpleasant third state, well, for example, South Vietnam half a century ago, but mostly it's South Korea, of course.
Now it will be a bit more complicated. Whom the DPRK leadership called a political dwarf or a runt.
Well, one of the options is the Japanese, because traditionally the Korean curse word for the Japanese, well, I won't repeat it, it's something like slaves or dwarfs. This comes from when 2000 years ago Koreans, or rather the Chinese, since it's originally a Chinese word, saw the Japanese, who at that time seemed shorter.
Great. And what insult, in your opinion, is the most common?
Right. Gangsters, dogs, or rather son of a bitch, then it's general, it's anyone. There is also the term war maniac, warmonger, and arsonist of war. There is probably a lot more, but just comes right
Yes,
away.
probably dogs and puppets are most regular.
Right, but puppets are very specific insults used for South Koreans, but dogs can be anyone.
Well, the imperialists are often used not only for against the US, but also against Japan.
The term imperialist is used for anyone they don't like. It's a bit like in Russian political discourse. When people call each other fascists, in political debates, it's not uncommon for things to escalate to light brawls, sometimes even with firearms, and both sides sincerely believe they are the anti-fascists, and the other side is the real fascists. So, here, imperialist is a universal term.
Alright, let's then figure out why the leadership of North Korea has chosen such diplomatic rhetoric every time they want to express their dissatisfaction or concern. Why do they use such sophisticated name calling?
So, as one high ranking North Korean diplomat said, this is our means of verbal deterrence. But I think that's not entirely the case. Most likely, the main target of this rhetoric is the domestic audience. On the international stage, to be honest, they sound funny, but being very skilled, rational, and responsible, they obviously understand this. I'm talking about the diplomats. It's probably more about the domestic audience when it's necessary to inspire the people and show that at this moment these are the ones we should hate. So why not throw in some insults? Besides, the general public gives the impression that we are cool if we speak like that. I suppose that works too. So I think this rhetoric is absolutely aimed at the domestic audience, primarily at the domestic audience, and unfortunately it creates a rather distorted impression of North Korean diplomacy. I would say the North Korean diplomacy and their diplomatic school is one of the best in the world. One of the best. They are masters at advancing their interests with minimal resources, practically empty handed. They show a deep understanding of their opponents' and allies' behavior and worldview. They've always had this keen understanding. Additionally, considering that we are dealing with what is essentially an absolute monarchy, where it seems like we will soon see a princess, Kim the Fourth, I understand though Kim the surname, but I would prefer to number them like great kings or marshals of the mighty republic. So, if we look from this point, they are capable of very long term planning. There is a thing that democracies are generally limited in their planning horizons, focusing up to the next elections or at best over a few electoral cycles. In non hereditary authoritarian regimes, it's a bit better, but still complicated by various factors. North Korean diplomacy can be planned over a much longer time frame. The people working in specific fields do so their entire lives. They rarely change keepers, no? In contrast, in the US or South Korea, especially in South Korea, foreign ministers generally change every 2 years. During one administration, you might see two or three different foreign ministers, and this is the average tenure for a foreign minister in the South, around 2 years. But it's likely, but we need to check, of course, 10 to 15 years in the north. So their capacity for long term planning is exceptional. Anyway, they are masters. However, the periodic breakdowns that foreign journalists love to quote, these statements that make them appear, frankly, rather ridiculous, make readers confused. We're talking about true masters of diplomacy, and these outbursts are primarily for domestic political purposes.
Yes, it's certainly more for the domestic audience, which sees that if their state can afford to speak this way about other countries' leaders, then their country must be quite powerful, strong, and independent. But at the beginning, you mentioned that this rhetoric could even be also considered as political deterrence. What did you mean by that?
Well, that might have been a joke by a very well known person, I won't mention names, but in any case, it seems to be about demonstrating their aggression and unpredictability. Because the feature of North Korean diplomacy is that it constantly creates an atmosphere of madness. This is similar to what Nixon once said about the madman theory. The idea that you need to pretend to be crazy so that everyone will fear you. I know that an American president said it about himself in connection with the Vietnam War. He hoped to scare Vietnamese with his supposed madness. So, North Koreans are deliberately creating an image of themselves as unpredictable, irrational people who might eat soap and bite anyone in their path with terrible force. But that's absolutely not the case. I repeat, they are brilliant Machiavellian pragmatists. They have skillfully manipulated Russia back when it was the Soviet Union, manipulated China and anyone else with very few resources. They maneuvered and manipulated situations in such ways that the other side understood them so well, but it was still easier to give into North Korean pressure and did what they wanted. Whenever an opportunity arose, they used it quickly and precisely. In short, they are masters of diplomacy. However, as an additional layer, they project this unpredictability. Periodic statements like "we will turn the world to dust" or "reduce it to nuclear rubble" are delivered with maximum dramatic flair. Of course, when they say this, they don't truly believe it, nor do they plan to turn the world into nuclear debris unless absolutely necessary. But once said, everyone thinks, better not mess with them. And that's precisely the point.
But doesn't it feel like lately, because of such aggressive rhetoric, South Korean media has also started to use aggressive language toward the North? It almost seems like tensions on the Korean Peninsula are as high as they were just before the Korean War.
Well, the tension isn't that high, and this is evident from incidents like balloons being sent over with trash and feces. A curious story. But back to your question, I wouldn't say that poor South Koreans are harshly reacting to provocation. The situation is more interesting. Firstly, the main source of this, I would say, shrill rhetoric, and I do mean shrill South Korean rhetoric. North Korea's is constantly high pitched. Is not some media outlets which are generally quite calm. The right wing media, which supports the current government, takes a hardline stance against North Korea, while the left wing media, which is in opposition, is much softer. Some even publish pro North Korean views, talking about how things are going well there and how we need to understand them because deep down, North Korean leaders are actually good people. However, these outbursts come mostly from the current South Korean presidential administration. If you look at the official dialogue, if we can call it like that, you'll notice that hostile rhetoric is coming from both sides. For instance, at the end of last year, 2023, South Korea's defense minister said in an interview that their special forces were actively training in methods to kill Kim Jong un as we speak right now, as we are having this conversation. This kind of rhetoric is very much in the same spirit as North Korean posters that depict nuclear bombs dropping on everyone. So, I think it's a characteristic of both sides. Each wants to show toughness to their support base. In South Korea, the right wing has a support base of about 20-30%, mainly older people or the younger generation. Right now, in South Korea, young people, especially men, are shifting strongly to the right, while women and girls are less so. So they are trying to show strength to this group. So, as the result, it was the same in 2017 when it was interesting to follow all the discussions. There were loud voices from North Korea calling the US all sorts of things as tensions rose. North Koreans yelled at Trump, "Daughter with dimension," while Americans responded to Kim, "Dwarf with a rocket." The only thing is that back then, South Korea was friendly toward the North Korean government. The South Korean president at that time was thinking day and night about how to provide everything to the North for free. Those who tell horror stories about hostility between the North and the South should check any UN websites to see which countries were the primary sources of unilateral free aid to North Korea. It was South Korea, but only when the left was in power, not the right, of course. The right wing didn't give a bit. That's how it was. Dangerous? Yes, a little dangerous. I want to refer the one of the prominent South Korean figure I recently spoke privately with, who said that, of course, it's a show on both sides. But he also said that some low ranking officer might actually believe it, and if he's already having a rough day or arguing with his wife, and there might be another officer from the other side having argued with his wife, they might go off the rails and end up killing 100 people. So, yes, I don't really like these games, and in my opinion, South Korea trying to engage in this kind of rhetoric is not a good thing. It's unnecessary. I even think that North Koreans shouting doesn't make much sense either, and when South Koreans begin to imitate them at the official level, it becomes strange and a little dangerous.
But still, from the perspective of an ordinary South Korean citizen, it looks pretty scary.
Let me repeat. I'll name a person, General C. He assumes that everyone understands the situation, including North Korean and South Korean diplomats, military, and intelligence officers. But at a lower level, people can get stirred up, and when two sides are fired up, even though there is no real tension or military confrontations, accidents can happen. There will be no war, but troubles can be. I repeat, in reality, there are no such tensions. There haven't been any military clashes, there haven't even been serious shootouts, only minor border violations by the North, which were likely accidental. The construction battalion was probably just working on additional fortifications, understandable under the circumstances. But this is a separate story. They accidentally crossed into South Korean territory, someone shouted at them, and they left. They probably just got lost. It's easy to get a little lost in those areas. So there is nothing serious going on. Even the trash balloons that were launched from the north to the south, I think that the North Korean side thought of something that would look as offensive and annoying as possible, but it will not cause any physical harm. Here from these balls that were launched, there are around 3,000, of which there are, well, I don't even know what the exact numbers, 1,500, 2,000 reached the south, one of them damaged a car's windshield, but that's it.
But in South Korean media, it's clear how concerned people are about the possibility of trash falling on them in the daytime.
Yes, it's annoying, yes, but there is no real harm. Sometimes the balloons are checked, but they are mostly filled with trash, feces, and waste, mostly just literal garbage. It's only dumping trash in the neighbor's yard.
Even if North Korean leaders got really angry and wanted to cause more harm,
Why?
they wouldn't send balloons with harmful waste.
Why would they? They don't want conflict. They aren't ready for one. They have problems with China, on whom they are heavily dependent right now, which they don't like. And the Chinese like it even less. They want the status quo. Why would North Korea provoke a conflict? Are they mad, as some press might suggest? No, they're not mad. I repeat, they have outplayed everyone, always. Their main goal is to ensure their own security first of all and drain everyone and everywhere on the second turn, and they made it all out. For example, let me remind you that in 2011, Russia wrote off North Korea's debt, around $11 billion, accumulated mostly during the 1920s. It had been hanging over them for a long time, and now it's been written off. I think a new debt could easily appear. As for their debt to China, who knows? China doesn't disclose that, but North Korea gets it. They are smart people. They don't want a conflict, but they know when a conflict might be useful, and that's when one might happen. But now there is no need for conflict. There will be no conflict. For instance, with the upcoming US elections, there is a chance that they will start firing a few rounds to remind everyone of their existence. Why? To remind the world they exist. Because the Democratic Party barely mentions North Korea. Said in passing, North Korea might want to remind the US that they want to negotiate, preferably on their terms. The North Koreans understand they won't get everything they want, but that's what diplomacy is for. It's a bargain. So they might fire some shots before the elections in October just to make themselves known. Not because they are crazy, but because they want to remind. In the past, they've even tested nuclear weapons, but they probably won't do that this time. China and likely Russia have strongly requested that they refrain from any nuclear tests, and since North Korea now relies heavily on China, and more recently Russia, especially from Russia's supplies, they are likely to comply. North Korea has a clear understanding of what needs to be done. On the other hand, if they see that conducting nuclear tests will cause significant problems for China, they might approach the Chinese and express their strong desire to conduct some tests, asking them to prevent such actions. This is a tactic North Korea often uses.
So, from North Korea's perspective, are threats more effective than trying to negotiate or be friend with their adversaries?
It depends. Currently, they can't build friendly relations because their enemies insist on nuclear disarmament, which is unacceptable to North Korea. Recent global events over the past 20 years have shown the consequences for countries that give up their nuclear weapons or stop their nuclear programs, voluntarily or under other circumstances. There were countries, it's clear what happened to them. North Korea seems no reason to abandon its nuclear arsenal while the US continues to make it a requirement for any agreement. Trump tried to negotiate an agreement that would recognize North Korea as a nuclear power under strict limitations. North Korea was willing to negotiate under these terms, but no agreement was reached. If Trump returns to power, North Korea might try again to negotiate a compromise. However, if the Democrats remain in power, they will not negotiate but demand complete nuclear disarmament, which is unacceptable to North Korea. Speaking about South Korea, the situation is obvious. Currently, South Korea's conservative forces would prefer North Korea to disappear, although they claim to want reunification on their terms. In practice, they don't want to deal with North Korea. They don't want to do anything. One of the goals of South Korea's aggressive rhetoric is meant to signal North Korea that no compromises will be made. Just ignore, pretending that there is nobody there. This is the approach. So, there is no way to be friends. When more friendly administrations were in power in South Korea, partially pro-Pyongyang administrations, they were willing to provide aid, and North Korea welcomed it. When something is given to you for free, who is against it? However, under the current conditions, this is unlikely. Moreover, even if the right wing loses and left forces come to power in South Korea during the next elections, who are rather positive towards North Korea and ready to unilaterally give different initiatives, they still won't be able to provide significant aid due to international sanctions. The US, as a key player in the UN Security Council, can block any changes to the existing sanctions regime. Without the US permissions, sanctions cannot be cancelled. Sanctions regime will maintain, even when Russia ignores it and China partially ignores it with caution. Accordingly, South Korea is forced to comply with the sanctions because there are United Nations sanctions. Even if the next South Korean administration is left and wants to help, it cannot do so without violating sanctions. North Korea probably will get nothing. The South doesn't want to, cannot give anything to the North. South Korea must comply with these rules because any aid or investment, or even small and harmless things, excluding maybe medicines and provisions, in North Korea would be seen as violation of sanctions. Thus, despite any changes in South Korean leadership, significant aid to North Korea remains unlikely. Thus, maintaining friendly relations with North Korea is challenging under the current sanctions regime. South Korea or any other country cannot engage in substantial cooperation without violating these sanctions. No one will be friends with them for money, and the North doesn't want to be friends for free. They want to earn something for this friendship. North Korea's situation is further complicated by the fact that many countries, especially in the West, the US view nuclear disarmament as a crucial issue. They are wary of the potential fate of countries that have given up their nuclear weapons, such as Libya, which face severe consequences. North Korea is aware of this and therefore sees nuclear weapons as a crucial safeguard against such outcomes. In addition, there are also internal political restrictions on friendship because excessive active exchange with the outside world is dangerous. They can simply destabilize the situation, and even if there is some kind of exchange, they have already tried. It will be some special zones with strict passport control. There are only highly trusted people who tattle on each other to be sure they are not too friendly with foreigners. But this is a separate topic. It won't come to that in the current situation. As I said, nobody can be friends with or doesn't want to.
Overall, there is no prospect of significant warming relations on the Korean Peninsula until a mutual point of contact is found between the Korean governments, the US, and other relevant nations.
I agree. Of course, there might be a slight thaw as in the winter, but sometimes it's a severe frost, but sometimes it's above zero. We will witness such winter. It will be better or worse, but I don't expect any changes. Current geopolitical dynamics, particularly US-China rivalry that is often called as the New Cold War, heavily influence the situation. North Korea is a very important player. The North serves as a crucial buffer zone for China, despite North Korea's dislike of China. That is mutual feeling for China to North Korea. They have different conflicts. There is a new round of a conflict started in the beginning of 2024, but still China needs stability in North Korea, while the rivalry between China and the US continues, and I assume it's long-lasting for decades. China will support North Korea's stability. Still, there is no specific sympathy between North Korea and China, but North Korea will be provided with limited assistance in such a way that North Korea suddenly doesn't start to fall apart. North Korea will accept this assistance, but look for other options. I repeat, they are ready to negotiate with the US, for example, with Trump. The chances of compromise are small, but they exist, not under another government. That's about how I think. It's all going to be for a long time, for the next 10-20 years. Expect minimal contact and limited interactions between North Korea and the outside world. The COVID-19 pandemic has further isolated North Korea, reducing the number of foreign embassies and international engagements. There were about 25 embassies and only 7-8 left, and now they are very reluctant to reopen the embassies.
They only allowed the South American
American
Yes, yes.
embassies, like the Brazilian one,
Yes, several have returned, like the Mongolian ambassador, but not the Western one. Still, there are no discussions about returning diplomatic missions or international organizations. The FAO delegation visited North Korea, but it's said that it was only because FAO is presided by China. That's why Pyongyang agreed to accept the delegation, as they don't want to argue with China. So I'm expecting the isolation period of tensions. Well, what I said sounded quite reassuring. That's why there is no need. There will be no conflicts. But I see a scenario in which the need arises, and then there will be a conflict, maybe even very serious. I even see the scenario of the Korean War, but not now. The North is not ready for it, so it won't happen.
what conditions will arise such a scenario?
If they develop and deploy a sufficient number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, if they create what is inaccurately named tactical nuclear weapons, for example, low yield nuclear weapons, which are currently mainly based on thermonuclear devices and those usable on the battlefield, they have ICBM, but there are questions. Yes, they are launching prototypes, but there are some doubts about their practical applicability and their ability to deploy them in reality. It's only a matter of time. They will manage to do this, but not now, and it's clear about tactical nuclear weapons, but they will do it too, but not immediately. Consequently, when they will do it, they might try to use ICBMs to prevent the US intervention in the conflict. They could then put pressure on South Korea and force some sort of concessions like half surrender. But these scenarios are very far off. First, they need 15 to 20 years to build the material base for such capabilities. Even if they manage to create these capabilities, it's not guaranteed they will want to use them. Having capabilities doesn't necessarily mean they will be realized. There could be other scenarios such as conflict over Taiwan. If that starts, China might put significant pressure on the North to create a distraction, though not necessarily a second front. This is possible. There could be various other possibilities. For example, I've already mentioned that there could be a scenario related to US elections that could lead to changes. Still, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's absolutely peace and quiet. Conflicts don't always arise because North Koreans are such crazy and unpredictable, but because in this specific situation there is a need to conduct some level of direct violence to resolve small scale problems or to achieve larger goals. So far, all the dramatic shouting should be watched like a quarrel between two traders at a fish market 150 years ago. Judging by the classical literature, they were fighting terribly.
We are all watching this long, life-lasting drama.
Yes, yes, even with your age, I think you will witness this drama for most of your life. This situation will likely continue for a long time.
Can we touch on the recent cooling in relations between North Korea and China?
Yes, temporarily, that's true. For instance, in July, the Chinese embassy had a reception marking the anniversary of the Basic Treaty. The treaty defining relations was signed in 1960. Last year, North Korean government sent the vice chairman of the Supreme People's Assembly to the celebration. This time, North Korea sent only the university's rector. The North Koreans and Chinese were very cautious. The Chinese part carefully removed the commemorative photos where Xi Jinping met with Kim Jong-un in May of 2018. Different data differs in details, but everyone generally agrees that the Chinese are starting to send back Korean workers. There are tensions. Why? The North Korean leadership and the people too do not have a very good attitude towards China. China's neighbors don't like China at all. I will not speak deservedly or not because China is big or because neighbors envy China or are afraid. We do not know this and we will not touch on it. Ask what Japanese, Mongolians, Vietnamese, and North Koreans, especially North Koreans, think about China. South Koreans had a more positive view of China in the past, but this has sharply deteriorated. South Koreans look down on China, and now, even in the South, the attitude is bad. Accordingly, the North Korean leadership has concerns. All the documents and materials have been published already, both by the Soviet side, now Russian, and the Chinese. For example, in 1956, China, along with the USSR, attempted to replace the North Korean leadership and remove the Kim family from power. This attempt was made in August-September 1956. Mao had called Kim Il-sung a traitor like Lee Hsien-man.
Records of the conversation are available and was published by the Soviet ambassador in China, who found the situation very interesting.
Currently, there are concerns and dissatisfaction with China. With the large payments from Russia to North Korea for arms supplies, the value of the North Korean won has dropped significantly over the past year from around 8,000 to about 15,000 won per dollar. This is a significant change, and this is not the course of some dealers, because the course at which you will officially change money in the bank adjusts to this.
Their exchange rate on the markets is the actual and official currency rate.
Yes, as you know, the market rate is the official one, so this rate dropped twice. Notably, food prices have slightly decreased, especially for wheat and wheat flour,
Which is obvious because of supplies coming from Russia.
wheat has never been grown on the Korean Peninsula. Seems like the supplies are really huge. North Korea has a positive view of Russia. North Korea's attitude towards China is less positive compared to Russia. They seem to have decided that while the money from Russia is flowing, they can afford to distance themselves slightly from China.
However, North Korean diplomats are well aware that China cannot get away from them.
Despite the slight distancing and discomfort caused to wealthy ethnic Chinese who have the right to permanent residency in North Korea. By the way, China is the only country with citizens who can get residentship in North Korea. Officially, about 5,100 Chinese live in North Korea. They are free to visit China and they earn big money. Now, North Korea causes several inconveniences to them. China doesn't like it, but North Korea understands that they may come back anytime and China will eventually take them back under their wing and continue to support them. China needs North Korea as a buffer zone, and no matter what North Korea does within certain limits, China will tolerate it. North Koreans know these limits and might try to mitigate potentially dangerous Chinese influence while still managing to cause some irritation.
Can we consider the recent visit of Putin to Korea and the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement as a victory for North Korean diplomacy?
So, North Koreans think it's the victory. During the visit, Kim Jong-un used the term military alliance 3 times, while Putin didn't use it at all.
Nevertheless, they might see it that way. I would like to point out that according to the census data in Russia, the number of women who believe they are married significantly exceeds the number of men who think they are married. This is an example of how a relationship can be viewed differently. So, yes, North Korea might feel this way. Currently, relations have indeed become closer because of the need of munitions and various military related equipment that North Korea produces for itself. Although the quality might not be very high, they are selling it and earning money, which they didn't expect to be possible. They are happy. However, in the long term, a military alliance like the one with China, which no one takes seriously, has significant problems. Historically, long term relations between Russia and North Korea have not worked well. The economic ties between the USSR and North Korea have always worked when they were subsidized by the Soviet budget. The economies are incompatible. North Korea might sell goods as a profit on the international market. I mean, what is worth being bought, but Russia doesn't need these goods, such as North Korean coal. For example, why would Russia need North Korean coal or pollock? Russia doesn't need pollock in commercial quantity. Russia needs a labor force. As always, a long term relationship based on commercial, mutually beneficial partnership will not work. But what worries me is that we have seen this more than once. First, there is a wave of expectations. I've been witnessing 4 waves now. I've been studying Korea for 40 years, and there were 4 waves. It lasts 2 or 3 years at most. Some completely unrealistic ideas because people who promote them read something in the newspaper but didn't understand anything. Then there is a disappointment, and as a result, some small project is thrown out. I think that long term economic cooperation is possible, but not on a large scale. There are examples of cooperation, such as logistic projects. For instance, there is a current project involving the use of the Razon port. There is a Russian company, Razoncontrans, which has managed to keep the port operational due to the efforts of a small group of people who had money to maintain it. This reminds me of a story of an abandoned airfield that a man maintained with his own efforts, and then an airplane made an emergency landing there. The Russian port would also have been closed if not for the enthusiasm of a small group of people who fortunately had little money to keep it afloat. Now the project has come to life. The use of North Korean ports can be a field of cooperation. Another potential area is the exchange of labor. With up to 100,000 North Korean workers in Russia, possibly more, 200,000. Can North Koreans find so many? Maybe, but not more. Moreover, if approached pragmatically and without illusions, there could be opportunities in light industry, but many specific issues need to be resolved to ensure quality and control. But North Koreans don't like to share this control. They give it only to the Chinese, and only because the community of ethnic Koreans in China is larger than in Russia. The ethnic Koreans in Russia left Korea 100 years ago, but the Chinese ones left not so long ago, and they have close ties with North Korea. They work through these ties. There are still other options. Russia might be involved in mining industries in North Korea as well, but this requires careful handling. There are interesting opportunities. But please do not tell me stories about rare earth metals and other resources. I have been hearing these tales for about almost half a century. So, there are fields in which cooperation is possible, but I'm afraid that when the relations are cooled, all these projects will be forgotten. Overall, moderate cooperation is possible.
What if we move away from these large scale projects a little bit and discuss a bit more the recent news about exchanges in healthcare, agriculture, and emergency services? Should we consider it as a part of cooperation, Or it is just that North Korean specialists receive specific mentorship and training from Russia.
This is a minimal cooperation. To my mind, it's more an activity conducted in those areas where at least something can be done. These are sites, areas with very little rare potential. At least something can be done and reported about. For example, send 20-30 students and write that we have started a student exchange. Organize some kind of joint study of some birds. Now they are cooperating there in some Russian regions.
By the way, recently, Rossельхознадзor sent several goats to North Korea.
Not just gods. The Kim family, the highest North Korean aristocracy, has tradition of horse riding. This tradition is interesting and has a long history that I won't go into now. They have always ridden Orlov trotters, which are the main breed they use for riding. So when Kim Jong-un is filmed riding a horse, he always rides Orlov trotters. During the visit, there were discussions about establishing dairy farming with cows. But this is a problem for North Korea due to the natural conditions. Goats are more suitable because goat milk has always been a part of their diet, and fermented goat milk products can be a good solution for lactose intolerance issues. Additionally, there were talks about building hospitals. Hospitals are always good. This is a promotion and people are helped. They have been trying to build hospitals on their own for a long time but have struggled. With Russian assistance, they might be able to complete these projects. There were also cultural exchanges, like performance by the Mariinsky Theater Vladivostok branch at the end of June. I don't remember exactly, seems it was in June, so several months ago. Such exchanges are relatively minor. They are more symbolic. Serious economic cooperation faces significant challenges and obstacles, and nobody knows how to resolve them. For several decades, the two sides have been trying but unable to do so. North Korea produces some goods cheaper and better than average. They really have such goods, but Russia doesn't need them. In contrast, North Korea would like to buy anything possible from Russia, but they cannot pay or don't want to. Sometimes there is no money, but sometimes they spare money, especially with the Chinese market nearby offering similar products with lower quality but lower prices. Therefore, many of these contracts, including cultural and educational exchanges and others, can be seen no more than just for show.
Recently, Korea Tours announced that the leadership of North Korea is ready to accept tourists starting in December of this year. What was the reason for the DPRK to accept only Russian tourists so far?
And they will continue to do so. I will correct your question. Recently, the leadership of Korea Tours once again announced that in the near future, tours will be resumed. I have heard this several times before. They periodically announce that it's going to happen soon, 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 telling people to grab their bags because the train is leaving. Why is this happening? It might be wishful thinking, perhaps, to prevent their tourists from fleeing, as client bases are crucial in the tourism business. Well, things they said raise huge doubts, especially among people who are involved in the tourism business. They said about the opening of the Sinjiang region in the middle of winter, but it's impossible because they generally do not like to bring foreigners there without opening Pyongyang. Moreover, I repeat, these messages are frequent from Korea Tours, so if you are interested, you can Google it. If I'm not mistaken, this is the third announcement. The previous two haven't been confirmed. The position remains quite clear. They only accept Russian tourists.
considering the fact that the number of Russian tourists is not huge. Before COVID, it was a few thousand people per year, and now, if they try very hard, they might reach a few tens of thousands, which is still a small number. As for Chinese tourists, there are no Chinese tourists there. Why? It's unclear. The main version is that North Koreans do not accept them, but there are several speculations, and some people say that China doesn't want to, because Korea and China are not in conflict, but in a slight quarrel. When Koreans do something that China doesn't like, China will not hesitate and might respond in kind. Also, another possible reason is that for the past 15-20 years, the main source of tourism money was China, while tourists from Russia are a microscopic amount. There were more Western tourists, but still very few. They did spend a lot, but they were still a small part of the overall amount. And now, with Chinese tourists absent, it's unknown whether it's China lightly punishing North Korea or something else, or it's North Korea, which allows only Russians. Currently, the North Koreans' line is very favorable towards Russia, which is highlighted as no one is allowed except Russians. I'd rather do not overestimate it, but it's worth mentioning. Western tourists might not appear there for 5 years or more. We'll see. I might be completely wrong, but these Korea tours announcements don't seem credible, especially against the background of almost complete absence of diplomatic contacts and North Korea's unwillingness to restore even limited diplomatic contacts.
Even unwillingness to return humanitarian workers.
Indeed, this all falls under diplomatic contacts, which have two aspects. The first is different humanitarian organizations. The only exception was the delegation from FAO, which I've already mentioned, but I believe this because China is currently chairing it. The Red Cross sends materials, but they don't let stuff in. They have recently accepted over 4 million vaccine doses, for example, because they haven't conducted basic vaccination for a while. But in general, they don't let foreign personnel in, and they don't need them now. They used to let them in because they had the idea of trading with the whole world. Now it's not possible because, well, you can negotiate, but then what? No one can trade with you due to sanctions. There are people ready to trade. There are horror stories of North Korea being under sanctions until 2006, but actually some Western companies were carefully investing there. For example, British American Tobacco, a British cigarette company, produced a significant portion of its brands in North Korea using cheap labor and then sold it. There were also attempts by Germans and Israelis to negotiate gold mining in North Korea. They have several gold deposits, but they didn't let Chinese or Russians in. Although they wanted various Western firms to work there, Germans and Israelis tried to negotiate, and they unsucceeded. So, up until the end of 2000s and the beginning of nuclear tests, many Western firms operated there. The reason they were few was not because it was prohibited due to sanctions, logistics, and other issues were the main reasons. But this is old history. Now sanctions are very strict, and until they are lifted, there will be no economically beneficial contacts with the outside world. And until there is no profit, the North Korea side will not be engaged in it. There is no sense.
Let's summarize the main principles of North Korean diplomacy and the main victories of this diplomacy.
There were lots of victories. We cannot even count them all.
The brightest one.
The brightest one, in the context of the end of the 1950s, the country, which was created by the Soviet Army's support, though it was popular occupation. It was a combination of revolution and occupation, but still it was the Soviet Army. The central part of North Korea was a quarter of Soviet ethnic Koreans who were sent there as army's members, etc. The leadership of the intelligence service of this country was Soviet Koreans, and the army was ruled by Chinese. The country, which was such dependable on others, managed to cut all control lines carefully within 3-5 years in the middle of the 1950s. Some of Soviet and Chinese figures were exiled, some of them were physically eliminated. That helped North Korea begin to act completely independently. They did this in a way that they didn't lose access to Soviet and Chinese aid. Although it was reduced, it remained significant. Then, in the context of the complicated Soviet-Chinese conflict, where the Soviet Union and China were fighting around Damansky Island and there were conflicts in Kazakhstan, North Korea, first of all, didn't get involved in this conflict, even indirectly, and secondly, managed to benefit from it by receiving money from both China and Soviet Union, even if it was quite complex, bearing in mind that there was the presence of a Chinese community in the country. North Koreans were tough with them, but not too tough to anger the Chinese. They knew how to keep the balance. Then, in the 1970s, a country with a very small GDP, though not in as dire situation as later, not Kuwait, they managed to become a noticeable player in the non-aligned movement, not as a main leader, but as one of the significant members. They survived the crisis of the Soviet Union collapse and the complete sudden halt of aid, and a less severe but still significant reduction in Chinese aid. After several very difficult years, during which a lot of people died, there were no social unrest due to excellent work of parties' propaganda and security agencies. Despite all this, they quickly managed to gain Western aid. In 1994, they signed the so-called Geneva Agreement with the US, where Japan and South Korea were also significantly involved. These countries quickly became North Korea's main sponsors just a year or two after a famine began. They managed to organize aid assistance from countries with which they were technically still at war. Isn't it impressive? It's like magic. It's a miracle. If figure skaters make 4 turns, North Korea makes 5. Is the biggest gathering of wizards on this planet. I mean, the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and so on, and so on, and so on. Their view of the world is very little ideological. Why? It's such a pleasure to talk to North Korean diplomats. Here I want to refer to Konstantin Valerianovich Asmolov. Konstantin, is he Valerianovich?
Yes, Konstantin Valerianovich.
Oh, yeah, sure. He has a lot of aphorisms. I want to cite one of it. He says, "Everybody thinks that North Koreans are mad fanatics and Americans are prudent cynics. But the bad news is the exact opposite. In contrast to South Korean or Western diplomats, North Koreans are little ideological, even if they have won its loyalty to their country.
the DPRK. They are very strategic, understanding how the world works, and they see it as a sort of jar with spiders. They adhere to an ultra realistic approach. There is an international relations theory developed by Mearsheimer. So, North Koreans are ultra Mearscheimerians, every man for himself and only God for everyone. But as God doesn't exist, everyone for himself. This is the basis of their diplomatic school, which is very powerful.
Thank you very much for the conversation. As always, it was very pleasant and enjoyable.